Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for choosing Across the Fence. I'm Will Michael in today for Fran Stoddard. White-tailed deer are one of the most studied and talked about wildlife species in the state. Deer are so important to our culture that it's the deer that sits atop the state seal. So to learn more about these animals, we've called on an expert from the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. Nick Fortin is the department's head deer biologist, and as such, he's responsible for all aspects of deer management in the state. Nick, I know this is a very busy time of year for you, so thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me on.
There have been some changes in deer management goals, some rule changes, I guess I should say. Tell us a little bit about what those goals are. What does the department, what do you look at, and the factors that go into deer decision making?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's a lot that goes into deer management, as you might expect. So what we just did recently is we changed a bunch of our hunting regulations to kind of bring them up to date to help us manage deer in today's world and in the habitat we have today in Vermont. That affects how hunters hunt, the seasons they hunt. The reason behind it has to do with our goals for the deer population. What do we want? And we just are in the process of rebuilding or rewriting our 10-year deer management plan, and that sets our goals. And our overarching goal for deer is to have a deer population that is sustainable in the long term, both in terms of the habitat and what people are willing to tolerate.
And of course, these issues are difficult. Everybody seems to be an expert and they have opinions. I won't say that we have two Vermonts, but it is something that you and I have talked about. So these deer management goals, when we talk about sustainability and herd size, there's sometimes not a lot of consensus in Vermont. Is that fair or not?
I think that's fair. I think there are a lot of people out there that would like to see a lot more deer than we have, hunters in particular. Obviously, if you're out trying to find one, you want more of them out there. On the other hand, there are people, foresters come to mind, that are trying to grow trees or grow crops that would like to see fewer deer. So our job is sort of finding that balance. The other reality we deal with in Vermont is we don't have great deer habitat, so we can't have as many deer.
So let me jump in and talk about that. What is the ideal habitat? Maybe talk a little bit about what a deer yard is and why they're so important.
So ideal deer habitat is sort of a broken landscape. Deer are often called an edge species, so they like a mix of fields and forest. And while we do have a lot of that in Vermont, most of our habitat is forest, and our forests are all kind of the same age, and they're an age that is incredibly unproductive for deer. They're sort of middle age, there's not a lot growing underneath. The other thing that limits us severely in Vermont is winter, and that's where deer yards come into play. So deer yards are areas of conifer cover, so sort of a canopy that...
Hemlock, pines, other things that are going to prevent deep snowfall.
Right, they hold up snow, they kind of block the wind, they provide shelter for deer through our hard winters. And that's really what limits our deer population here in Vermont, is we can lose a lot of deer in a tough winter.
What's the primary diet?
So it depends on time of year. Summer they're vegetarians, they're out there eating forbs and grasses and anything green, basically, they can find people's gardens. In the winter, they're primarily eating browse, so the twigs and buds of woody plants, which is not very nutritious. This time of year is when they're fattening up for winter, and this happens to be a good food year. We've got a lot of apples, a lot of acorns, beech nuts. They're really chowing down on those right now.
Nick, the Fish and Wildlife Department website reports there's about 65,000 Vermonters who will get a hunting license. How are those fees used, and maybe a little bit about what's the contribution of the non-resident hunter?
So the license fees are one of our primary funding sources from the Fish and Wildlife Department. I think they make up roughly a third of our budget. And so those go to not only managing game species, deer, bear, moose, whatever else gets hunted, but also all of the other management we do. Those funds help us purchase land for wildlife management areas and manage that land. It even helps in some cases manage non-game species.
But that's also, let me just jump in to point out that you have a tax checkoff in which people can support non-game species. So a lot of the hunters are supporting wildlife all across the state.
Right.
And there's also an opportunity for non-hunters to do the same.
Right, and we get money from the state general fund as well. So, you know, the average Vermonter is contributing to our department. It's not just hunters, but hunters make up the bulk of it through their license purchases. As far as non-resident hunters, we're not a huge destination state. We certainly get people coming from neighboring states or people who still have family here in Vermont. But the reality is if someone's going to travel to hunt, they're likely to go to a place with more deer than we have here in Vermont.
So when is it legal to hunt deer in Vermont, and what's considered a legal deer to be able to harvest?
So we have 4 seasons in Vermont. We have an archery season, which for most people is the month of October, basically. We have a youth season that just wrapped up this past weekend. We have a rifle season, which is our traditional season that everyone thinks of when they think of deer hunting. That's coming up here. And then
Sorry, that's going to be, it's about 2 weeks, as I recall?
That's a 2-week, 16 days.
16 days at the end of November.
At the end of November, yep. And then last we have a muzzleloader season in December,
Yep.
Which is a few days. And there's actually an archery season that coincides with that, or a second half of the archery season that coincides with that. But
Okay.
So those seasons. And then as far as what's a legal deer,
Yeah.
we still have an antler point restriction in Vermont. So for most hunters, a buck has to have at least 2 antler points on one side, which is sort of trying to protect some of those younger deer, let them live, get a little bigger.
Because that is a big deal. Again, I'm going to confess, I'm a non-hunter, but again, working with you and others, I have an understanding. That's one of the issues, that if you can get a buck that's, instead of 16 or 24 months old, to get somebody to be 3 or 4 years old, that can be a challenge in Vermont?
It can. So we're a fairly small state, and as I mentioned, we don't have very high deer numbers, but we do have a lot of hunters for the size of the state we are. And so, you know, without some form of protection, not many of our deer survive to those older age classes. And all hunters, to some level, are interested in bigger, larger deer, whether it's bigger bodied or bigger antlered, and those are older deer. So we have to give them a little protection, help them get there.
You address some of the habitat and dietary issues. What about reproduction and life cycle? A little understanding of when they mate. When do we see the little critters that are out with spots, the fawns and whatnot? When do we see those? What's their life cycle like?
So deer are mating now. Now is right about the peak of the breeding season, and the timing of that has actually more to do with when they give birth. So because we have hard winters in Vermont, fawns need to be born late enough so things have greened up in the spring and there's actually food for the doe to produce milk, but then early enough so that they can reach a big enough size before the next winter comes. If they're born too late, they'll be too small going into that winter and they won't survive. So the timing of breeding is very, very importantly timed to when those deer have to be born in order to survive the following winter. So that's the sort of breeding life cycle. Again, this time of year, deer are pretty much, other than breeding, are trying to fatten up heading into winter. So those fawns will be born, the deer that survive winter, those fawns will be born in first week of June, generally. I mean, there's a window around that.
So part of what I was interested in, you're talking about the gestation period then, isn't just a couple of months.
No,
it's actually quite long. It sounds like it's closer to 7 months.
It's about 200 days.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's closer to a human gestation period than you might think.
Yeah, that surprises me. I didn't quite focus in on that.
And so, the other thing to keep in mind is these deer are producing, most adult does are producing twins pretty much every single year. And they're growing that fetus in the winter during the hardest time for them to be doing it.
I caught that. That is impressive.
So they're an impressive animal, and so they're giving birth again in early June. So usually there's sort of a lull in deer sightings that happens right around when they give birth, because those does aren't moving much, and no one really starts seeing fawns until they're 4, 6, 8 weeks old, and they're up to walk moving around with the doe. Okay. And then people really start seeing them.
Well, you talked about, again, just magnificent animals, creatures, and we've been seeing some of the trail cam footage. And in some of these, they come right up to the camera. Are they as curious as they appear to be? And sort of how smart are these animals in the range of the wildlife kingdom?
Well, definitely curious animals, very curious. That's kind of what gets them in trouble a lot. But they're very intelligent. I guess smart is sort of a subjective thing, but they're definitely survivors. They figure out what works and what doesn't, and they'll find a way to survive.
Yeah. We have a couple of minutes left here. We hear about chronic wasting disease. I think there's some other issues that are out there. Does Vermont have those, and is this part of management, things you have to be cognizant of?
So we're lucky in that we don't have any major deer diseases at the present time. Chronic wasting disease is a huge concern for us. If it were to get here, I don't know if it would wipe out our deer, but it would probably spell the end of deer hunting, greatly reduce our deer numbers. So we do everything we can to try to keep it out of the state. But currently our deer are fairly healthy.
We're going to need to say goodbye here in just a moment. You look forward to hunting season every year. I would suspect that it's a tradition, as it is for many families. So what do you look forward to when you're out in the woods, or as you come to around Thanksgiving time, and what you'll be thinking about and what you'll be doing?
For me, I have a family camp up in the Northeast Kingdom, and for me, deer season's more about going to camp than it is really trying to find a deer in the woods. But I thoroughly enjoy my time out in the woods as well. That's really the part that I look forward to.
And I can see why, with all these beautiful animals that you're going to get to see, not just the deer, but other things. Nick Fortin with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me on. For
more information about deer and deer hunting, or any other aspect of wildlife in Vermont, you can check the Fish and Wildlife website that we've put on your screen. It's vtfishandwildlife.com. That is our program for today. We know you have choices, so thanks for choosing us. I'm Will Michael, inviting you to join us back here each weekday afternoon for another visit Across the Fence.